Tēnā koutou, tara plata. Very warm welcome to University of Canterbury's public lecture series. We're very lucky to have some of New Zealand's top newsroom leaders here. Are the mics even on if you can't hear?
You need to speak into them, sorry. You need to speak into them. Take them off.
Here.
Take them off.
Before we get started, I just have to do some housekeeping. If you need toilets, you'll find them straight out here. If you hear the fire alarm, don't panic and wait for me and the helpers out front will guide you out of the building and to the evacuation point. Same thing, in the very unlikely event of an earthquake, follow our lead. We all know what to do now. It's unnecessary to say that, but it's all part of our university health and safety. The format for the evening is that we will have a discussion up here for about 40 minutes and then open up for question and answer from the rest of you. So if you've got some great questions, save them till a little bit further in. That would be really helpful. And I'll start by introducing the people here, all of whom have a connection to Christchurch, which is great. So Paul Thompson is current Chief Executive of Radio New Zealand, but also former editor of the Press newspaper and my old boss, actually. So it's a little odd sitting up here. Joanna Norris is the current Editor-in-Chief of Fairfax Media South Island and the outgoing editor of the Press newspaper, about to move to Christchurch NZ, the Economic Development Agency for Christchurch. And Mark Jennings, who is former head of news and current affairs at TV3, long-standing broadcast journalist, and the co-founder and editor of Newsroom, which broke a big political story this week on possible spies. And also the connection to Christchurch because his career started here with TV1. And we're really, really privileged to have them here because what we're really interested in the era of Trump and alternative facts and post-truth era, fake news, whatever you want to call it, journalism seems all the more important. Good journalism seems all the more important. And I guess I wanted to kick off by asking the three of you, what does good journalism look like? When we're talking about quality journalism, what do we mean? We start with you, Paul.
I can start. Good evening, everyone. Great to be here. Lovely to see some familiar faces in the crowd as well. Good to be back in Christchurch. And thank you, Tara, for organising this talk. These are really challenging times for the news media, and the stakes are actually quite high around this because good journalism is as vital as food and water to a functioning society. The irony is that even whilst a lot of journalism is being hollowed out around the world, including in New Zealand, some of the best work I've seen in my career is happening at the same time. So if I just think about things that I've noticed recently that I think are really strong. Has anyone seen the spin-offs Unsheltered series on homelessness in New Zealand? You know, I really got content envy when I saw that. Almost a deconstruction of fantastic TV current affairs with a twist. And I think it just really put me in the story. I think you mentioned Newsroom's scoop this week around the National Party MP with links to Chinese intelligence. I think that did show one characteristic of good journalism. It causes discomfort. Some people don't like it, and there's always pushback. So what I'm seeing happen in spots all around the industry is some really good, thoughtful work that is about verified information around issues that are really important, that move the dial, that puts pressure on the political class, and really creates engagement through social media and through multimedia. There's lots of good examples of it. If I can just talk about one small story that RNZ's been involved in, I see that the head of Steel and Tube, the listed company, resigned this week after we've been vigorously reporting his business and his industry, the steel industry, and the quite shocking lack of standards around the supply and testing of steel. The first story we got about Steel and Tube was last year, where we proved that the independent lab testing their steel, which is going into bridges and buildings, including significantly in this city, was actually tested by their factory and falsely accredited with the paperwork. So I think that is another example of good journalism and had an impact with that company having to change its direction in the end.
Joanna, here in Christchurch, the press won a lot of plaudits for how strongly connected it was to its community post-quake. Can you talk a little bit about what that means in terms of quality journalism?
Yeah, I think the attributes that Paul has articulated are really around holding the powerful to account, and that is fundamental to quality journalism, one of the key characteristics. But another is ensuring that you're also reflecting the good that's happening in the community. And that's the balance that we have worked really hard to achieve in the post-quake era, because we viewed it as essential to our community that we were able to help this community recover. So it was a matter of not only holding the powerful to account, and I'm incredibly proud of the work that we've done in the post-quake period in order to do things like keep an eye on corruption through the rebuild, really champion the great challenge that we still have in this community around mental health and the well-being of this community. And that requires us to hold people to account, but also show examples of goodness. So look at where we do have regeneration that's occurring and where people are doing good, hardcore community work that deserves celebration, because we strongly believe that success brings success. And then the other element, I think, is making sure that you truly reflect your community, so that there's genuine commitment to covering diversity, cultural diversity, ideological diversity, and that is often work that goes unrewarded in terms of commercial return, but it's absolutely essential to make sure that you are growing a kinder community and a really inclusive community. And I think that's one thing that a number of organisations make a really good commitment to. Radio New Zealand in particular has done some tremendous work in terms of growing our commitment to te reo in particular, and Carol and Paul have really made a strong stand on that, and I think that's absolutely tremendous.
Mark, you've started Newsroom with that branding of journalism for thinking New Zealanders. So how do you see yourself in that market of quality journalism?
Well, we saw that there was, I guess, a gap in the market, and that's not being critical of anybody sitting here, because I think Radio New Zealand aspires to quality journalism too, and Fairfax and the Herald, New Zealand Herald as well, but it's perhaps a little bit more patchy for them because of the amount of material that those two big organisations churn out. So we saw ourselves, I guess, in a way, trying to occupy a niche. One of the things that the two big digital sites do, Fairfax and the Herald, is they go through a huge amount of material in a single day, huge number of stories, whereas we only do 5 or 6 stories a day. But our idea is to, we'd say, we're sort of like the slow food movement, we're the slow journalism movement. We like to stand back, reflect, and not get panicked into writing something until we have a full picture of it. Now, it's quite easy to get panicked, to be honest, particularly when you see stories flying out on other media organisations. So we have a saying in our place, hold your nerve. And as soon as anybody starts, I better write this, we all shout out, hold your nerve. But it's easier said than done, because as journalists you're naturally competitive. We've spent most of our lives in organisations where you do write that story and get it out. But we think too, though, that like Paul and Joanna, there is extremely good journalism being done in most of the media organisations in this country. So the media is undergoing a lot of change as well, but I think we're seeing actually a little bit of a resurgence in this. We're seeing a lot of quite good investigative journalism, I think. I think Newsroom, our own site, has been a little bit of a catalyst in this, just a little bit. I'm not claiming any credit, but most organisations now actually have an investigations arm. Fairfax does, Herald does, Radio New Zealand, I know, is working on one or would like to have one.
Building one, yeah.
So yeah, I think in a funny way it's a tough time to be in the media, but it's also a good time, and there is good stuff being done. I think in terms of quality journalism, the things that we always think about is, and it's slightly old-fashioned, but fairness and balance still figure highly in our thinking. Accuracy and context. All the stories we do try to provide some context, and that's the bit that takes a bit more time and a bit more experience. It's hard to do when you're really churning over things fast. But I think, you know, there's a place for all of this, and we've got our little spot.
Would you agree, Joanna? I mean, you know, you're overseeing stuff digital first reported across the South Island, which doesn't have the luxury of 5 or 6 stories a day, and you're producing hundreds of stories a day. So how do you manage that tension between slow, considered journalism and filling the paper?
Yeah, look, I just love that phrase, hold your nerve, and I think it applies to all models of journalism. There's a time and a place for that. We often talk about a multi-speed approach, so there will be times when breaking news is absolutely essential, and we know that our audience has a demand for fresh content often, and that's how you build an audience of scale. But you also need to build into your teams, and I think we've done that successfully, a much more considered and long-term approach. They're working on the investigative pieces, the multi-platform pieces that take a lot more time and resource, and really being committed to that. And I reflect on the work we've done recently around the Black Hands podcast, which took more than a year for us to develop that. And Martin van Benen, who's one of the country's best investigative journalists, was committed to that project, but he was also doing other pieces of work at the same time, which took a different speed approach. So it's a matter of setting yourself targets across all of those areas, you know, committing to breaking news and serving that audience need for updated content about their world, but also really making that commitment to the longer form material that takes more energy, more resource, and a greater commitment.
I suppose the other tension that none of you have mentioned is also the, you know, we aim for the quality product, the investigative journalism, the informative work, but we have metrics that tell us that audiences really like that story about Kim Kardashian, and we need audiences to pay the bills. We need those ratings, we need those eyeballs. How do you reconcile the two?
And if I leap in here, because we've got some really interesting detailed metrics around what audiences actually want, and it's a common misconception that it is the Kardashians. We know that of the top 50 stories that were published on Stuff last year, so it's a huge sample size, the top, I think, 36 of those were content that we would describe as hard news. Only 5 of the stories were entertainment stories, and they were about The Bachelor. Overall, there is an interest for that popular content, and that's part of the mix, but it's certainly it isn't for us what drives audiences to read content.
Right. Why do we see so much of it then?
I think if you were to do a detailed analysis of the material that we produce, which we do, you would find it's a much smaller proportion than perhaps the commentators would suggest.
Right.
And it's a conveyor belt of cheap content, which is why organisations will cover it. And there's an element of celebrity in a country that's starved of it. And I think at one stage, Stuff and Herald, about 3 or 4 of the most popular stories were about The Bachelor. It's just coming in the door. So, but there is a place for that. People are interested in it. There is a place in that. I'm happy to say where I work, we make a virtue of never covering that stuff. Unless we're talking about how they're covering it. But the point I'm making is, and this is really, I think, one of the more important things I'm trying to say, is New Zealanders need a range of media, of news media. The worst thing is that over the next 10 years, the only news media company of size is RNZ or TVNZ, publicly funded or government owned. What we need is a range of small, large, commercial, non-commercial, community, legacy businesses and startups, and people should have the choice of reading something to make their morning a little happier about Bachelor, but equally they should be able to go in and listen to an in-depth radio interview with the Prime Minister or a hard-hitting investigation. And we're seeing that range of material is available at the moment, but I have to say there's probably a possibility that it won't be available in the next 5 to 10 years unless, I think, as an industry and as a society, we start to think about how we're going to nurture this and nurture that diversity. So you can have your All Bran and your muesli, and you can also have, something which is more of a treat as well, because we all like that range.
That raises the interesting issue of collaboration, because I think all three of your newsrooms have been collaborating more together to produce quality work across more than one newsroom, haven't you?
Yeah.
Well, Paul's really led that, I think. And he's probably done it for some interesting reasons too, but and they might have just had a payoff. But I think the New Zealand media has got more mature, and we tended, and I was part of it too when I was at TV3. We had an immaturity where we wouldn't cooperate because we always felt we'd do it better than the other guy. We always felt we could beat TVNZ. Herald always felt they could beat Fairfax. Radio New Zealand thought they could beat commercial radio. But we've sort of grown up, and I think it's been forced by the economics that or lack of them that we're facing. And if you can get your product to a wider audience, it makes sense. And I think, though, it also depends on the current crop of news executives. And if you're lucky enough to have a more mature crop, then I think we'll see more collaboration. It's a good thing.
Does that mean that if you're talking about that being dependent on personalities at the top, does that mean that you're not sure that that's maybe going to stay, that collaborative model?
Well, I can just tell you from my own example, we could never get anybody at TVNZ to collaborate on anything. We used to spend a lot of money flying helicopters to the same crash, or we used to spend on election night, where if you used one van, outside broadcast van, you could save $20,000. No. So, because they used to think, TV3 doesn't have enough money, if we can squeeze the shit out of them here, excuse my language, this will impact their profit. Of course it never did, we always found the money to do it, you had to. So it was really flawed thinking. But that's changing now. It's just like newspapers being printed in the same printing press. It doesn't change whether you've got the better newspaper. Just as coming out of the same outside broadcast van doesn't change. It's your talent in front of the camera, not what's going on behind it.
I mean, the Panama Papers story was a collaboration between TVNZ and Radio New Zealand, wasn't it? And do you see that as a model for future in-depth journalism?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the phrase I like to use is journalism is exponential. And so this idea that we used to think, as Mark said, if you had a scoop, it was yours. Well, it wasn't yours because someone just ripped it off, the next day in the next news cycle. These days they'd rip it off in the next second. And we all thought we were in the news business, but we weren't. We were in the advertising business, which was supporting a news business. The advertising bit's going. So what we're left with are some existential questions about the nature of journalism. And good journalism actually gains impact by being widely reported and everyone bringing their view, their perspective, some more depth. I think the Chinese MP story today has been picked up by the Herald, and they've sort of nudged it along with a good scoop. That's how it should work. And I think a big part of the future in terms of creating that media ecosystem that's providing diversity and has a range of voices, probably the biggest part of it will be the collaboration that we do. And from RNZ's point of view, we're really fortunate to be publicly funded, and we think if we're publicly funded and if someone else can make use of the content and get it to more people, we say fill your boots, which is, we're in a good position to do that. But I think it goes beyond that, and I think you'll see a lot of partnerships developing.
Because I'm interested, you've been talking about diversity, Joanna, and the partnerships with iwi Radio, Māori TV. I mean, and I think TV3 was working informally with Māori TV in the past as well.
We had a formal arrangement.
Yeah, I mean, those partnerships are really important, aren't they? Because we struggle to get Māori Pacific journalists into our major newsrooms. So do you see that as a way of helping to boost the breadth of our
Exactly.
representation.
So I think if you can imagine a Venn diagram where there's a crossover of shared content that can be produced in collaboration. I talk about, for instance, court coverage. It doesn't necessarily make sense to send 4 journalists to cover the same story in court. It's a single set of sources. If you are able to be efficient around court coverage, for example, that enables you then to extend your coverage to other areas that are not so well covered. So I think that's where we'll start to see a lot more collaboration, and that makes a lot of sense in terms of efficiency of resource. So it's not only around stories like the Panama Papers, but it's actually around some of that bread and butter content that we need to produce to support the public interest, but we can get greater efficiency around it.
Is there a danger, because some of the concerns from the Commerce Commission and the Fairfax NZME merger was around more sharing of content and the dilution of voices around the regions and so on. I mean, is that a tension then with that future of collaboration?
Yeah, well, I think the key to that is that if you share some of the costs of core coverage, some of the things we should be covering, like local government, local sport, business, courts, Joanna mentioned, if you share that and make that more efficient, you can then put your own resource into your more in-depth, tailored, high-quality content. The challenge is that people don't just put that to the bottom line, and that would be a real risk. But if somehow you can make the industry work more closely together to put more of our quality time and our quality people and our resources into those stories that really matter, it could work. But there will be some question marks around whether that's how it will play out.
Do you agree, Mark? I mean, how would you fit into a network like that?
Yeah, I think Paul's point's a really good one, that it doesn't go to the bottom line, because under current ownership models and structures, and again, I'm not picking on Fairfax, but they're owned by an Australian. I don't think the Australian owners have done New Zealand many favours. Joe might disagree with me, but I think while there's a profit imperative, I think any savings that come out of the newsrooms will go to the bottom line. And you really have to think about changing, perhaps, the perception that news and journalism is a way to make money. I'm really starting to think that it's not. Yeah, in the old days, yes, but now that Facebook, Google, and Twitter control the distribution platforms, I don't think it is.
Where does that leave us then? Because if it's not a way to make money, who will be doing it? We don't have many philanthropists with deep pockets here in New Zealand.
Well, I think if we immediately knew the answer to that, we'd be a lot richer than we are, and a lot less challenged. I am still really optimistic that there are commercial models that will support some journalism in this country, but I think that needs to be supplemented by an adequately funded public sector also, and there's some reasonable thinking going into that currently ahead of the election. I think the greatest challenge and the thing that worries me most is the future of regional news, and commitment to high quality coverage of the public interest in our smaller regions, because that's where it is really most challenged. They are communities that are not well served by our national news organisations, and I mean I know that often in Nelson, for example, the only reporter at a council meeting will be a reporter employed by my organisation, which is a commercially funded organisation, and that's becoming increasingly challenging. And I think that's where we as an industry need to come up with some really responsible solutions, because New Zealand needs journalists in our regions holding people to account.
Are some regions more vulnerable than others? Or are they all at risk?
From a commercial perspective, yes. Some are more vulnerable than
Smaller
others.
ones.
Yeah, I mean, and it's the challenge a number of industries are facing in regional New Zealand. They can't attract staff, there's not the economic growth that's required to support strong commercial entities. And so there's a matter of having to subsidise some of those regions. Some organisations can cope with that level of subsidy, and others are not prepared to. And that's the challenge that any commercial organisation faces.
Would you agree? I mean, when you were at TV3, I mean, you were overseeing the bureaus across the country.
Yes, and you only have to look at Dunedin as a really good example. one TV3 reporter about half a TV in Zealand, for a fairly major city, really, and with a lot of news coming out of it. Man, if that's the best Dunedin can do, how's Ashburton going to go? Well, I'm not sure. Some of the Timaroos and stuff. I think there's also this issue in New Zealand that we are a small country, and we're not a wealthy country either, even though we might have a supposed rock star economy. We're not wealthy. Regional news is always been really challenging in New Zealand, and as Joanna says, there has to be a cross-subsidisation. It's a problem that we've got 33% of this country's population in Auckland. It's a big problem. That's where all the economic power and clout is now centralised, and it's tough.
Do you agree, Paul? I mean, you're overseeing a network. You've got one reporter and two reporters in Dunedin. Yeah.
We've got about 8 regional offices throughout the country. Most of our staff are in Wellington and Auckland, so we're not quite all in Auckland. Look, it's really reinforcing that point I made in my opening comments. The stakes are actually really high here. It's about the kind of society we want to have, and there's certainly been more hand-wringing lately. There are some solutions, I think, developing, and a more active role for the state will be part of the solution, but won't be the entire solution. But I think, Tara, you did mention the Googles and Facebooks and the Netflixes and the Amazons and the Apples. Marvellous companies that we all use their fantastic services, but they pay very little tax, but are taking the lion's share, Joanna, of digital advertising, and don't really put a penny into credible local content. And I think this makes it an issue of national sovereignty. We can't be a functioning democracy at the nether ends of the world and maintain the wonderful country that we have if we don't have access to a range of reliable information, and perhaps taxing those organisations would be one constructive thing to kind of bring a bit of money back into the industry. It's not easy to do. There are reasons involving international treaties why it would be complex, but they should pay their fair share of tax, and that would just be one idea that perhaps could take us away from the hand-wringing and actually something constructive, but I don't see any sign of it happening. But I think it will become more of a pressing issue over time.
Do you think that the politicians are paying enough attention to the journalism sector? No.
And nor because I now work in Wellington on the terrace. The policymakers who often working on a 10 to 20 year horizon do a lot of the thinking in behind the policy that the country might need at some stage and what the politicians might support. They're not doing that work either, and they haven't been allowed to do the work, and it's hard work. It's really hard work. We're starting now to see it happen, probably 10 years too late. So at some stage, some new thinking will have to come through.
They've got their head in the sand. And it's all parties. There's a real gutlessness when it comes to this issue of taxing international companies. Facebook, it's not just in this country. Facebook and Google are bleeding media dry around the world. But here, I'm less optimistic than Paul. I don't think they will wake up. I think it'll be a desperate situation before anybody does anything. Someone will have to go to the wall, and then will be something happening.
So are we not doing enough as journalists and media organisations to press issues?
If Google and Facebook are bleeding mass media dry, isn't there a crisis point where they don't get the news content they require to feed those audiences? Is that even a possibility?
Well, I don't know whether anyone's read that big piece in the London Review of Books last week about Facebook. They don't need anyone. They don't need anyone. It's a myth that they need anyone. They're about fragmenting community, not joining people together. They give you your echo bubble and it makes money for them. And they target you. You're the product and they're they have you under surveillance. It's quite a sobering read. So maybe Google is slightly more dependent on credible content, but cat photos would probably do the job equally enough if the news wasn't there.
Sorry, Joanna, a follow-up question. If we accept maybe that regional newsrooms are struggling, is local ownership actually something that would happen? If we also accept what Mark says, that there's not a lot of money in it, but do we go back to local ownership in some of those places? Do you think that's a viable option in some of those regional centres like Canterbury and Invercargill and those places?
And Westport.
Yeah, I think local ownership is a good option for some of our local communities, so people who are living in the communities and committed to working on the smell of an oily rag. Though people need to be aware that journalism is expensive and it's important to invest properly in it. And I do see examples of some local ownership where they don't make that commitment, where they're running a paper with one journalist, and that's not acceptable really if you're going to be doing the job properly. So I think yes, there will be those who will develop models where they nurture and support the local public interest, but that needs to be the objective, not just purely making a coin.
Perhaps you could come here, Mark, because you have just started your own organisation.
Yes, and I can tell you it's financially challenging. And there's
Is that why there are no South Island reporters yet?
are you talking for Newsroom?
Yeah.
We're keen to rectify that, and I was talking to Tara about that today. We're actually canvassing some names.
Good to hear. Supplementary question. Margaret, University of Canterbury. What does sponsorship mean in your excuse me? When you're getting sponsored in the new version, does that shut out competitors of your sponsors? You've got I'm talking about the Newsroom model,
yes,
where you need to get sponsorship. What does that make it difficult to cover some areas that might be in conflict with your sponsors' interest?
It's a really good question, and we debated that amongst ourselves. What we've done is that in those sponsorship contracts, we have explicit clauses around that, so that it's very clear to the sponsors that they cannot exert any editorial pressure on us. I guess though, this type of sponsors, and when we presented that, the sponsors have said, well, that's nuts, because we know what you're about, and we're sponsoring you because we fully understand that the New Zealand media is in trouble and it needs new independent startups to succeed. Now, having said that, we've got a few enlightened CEOs or whatever of these companies that are sponsoring us. I'm not saying that that's a wider and general thing. I think there's another problem though that we have to fight against is our own self-censorship. Because let's say Holden is one of our sponsors. Let's say there's a negative story about Holden or something negative in the car. We had one about diesel cars. And somebody said while we were looking at that story, oh, Holden might not be too keen about that. And so it started, and then we went, no, don't be stupid. Well, of course we'll run the story and do it. And we didn't hear any peep out of Holden. But I think that's what happens in newsrooms. You start to have this second guessing of yourself. And it takes leadership in the newsroom to say, no, let's get on with it, don't worry about it. I don't know if that answers your question. But I think there's, just going back on that regional media side of things, the key to it is regional businesses supporting that media. If they don't buy the ads, and if they don't support it, then it goes under. So I think the community and the businesses in the community have a real responsibility. They'll be the ones that keep the media alive.
What about subscribers? We've talked about businesses and news media trying to come up with inventive ways of finding money, but what's the role of the reader and the audience in terms of actually valuing quality work that's done?
I can quickly, I've been talking a lot, but you know, when you think about what people spend on a flat white in Auckland, and I'm no different to that, it's somewhere between $4 and $4.50 for a cup of coffee. Yet, you know, people have no compunction about that, but when you ask them to pay for something, you know, high quality news product online, ooh, you know, so I don't know, it's tricky.
So you're overseeing newspapers around the South Island that have seen some retrenchment. So, you know, Marlborough Express has gone to 3 days a week, Nelson Mail now as well. So you're clearly grappling with those issues of how to fund those smaller papers and so on. What's your thinking on the, you know, presumably all of you here have come because you care about journalism and the state of journalism, but how do we translate that into revenue that sustains it?
It's a wonderful question. The irony in Nelson and Marlborough, where we've recently made some changes to our print publishing model, is that we've actually got larger audiences there than we've ever had. But it's revenue, and it's advertisers who are prepared to fund advertising. We all know the dollars to dime conundrum that occurs when print advertising transfers to digital advertising. I think, I mean, as I said before, if we knew the solution, we would be doing it. And it's just simply a matter of continuing to try different alternatives. Our strategy to fund commercially funded journalism is to diversify. We've launched an ISP, which has been very successful, and you'll continue to see us support our journalistic business with other activity. Because as Mark said, journalism alone and selling journalism alone is probably not the solution.
So why would Fairfax do that if it's not commercially viable, given you're a commercial company?
It comes down to that question of what you're prepared to subsidise, and that's they are questions that the CEO needs to answer and the board needs to approve. So to some extent we have subsidised journalism for a long time in regions that are less profitable than others. But we are a listed organisation, so we need to make good decisions on behalf of our shareholders. That's a legal requirement. And we continue to make a very strong commitment to regional New Zealand. We have more journalists in the South Island than any other organisation, substantially more, and that's a costly business. So we're hopeful that the communities will continue to support us by paying for some of our products, and that's really important to us.
So why won't you take our money? No, seriously. You stepped up and you said $4.50 for a flat white in Auckland right now.
Yep.
So I've emailed your editor. Your editor. Sorry, ma'am. I'm sorry, I don't know the names. I didn't catch those.
She is the editor.
Joanna.
What did I say?
Sorry, I emailed someone there. It might have gone now, whose name was Patrick.
Oh, Patrick Crudson?
Possibly.
Yeah. Yep.
I've got $5 in my pocket. Okay? Google will take it off me, and they tell me this 5 days a week. Facebook will take it off me 5 days a week. For me to give you money, I've got to give you $1,000 on ramp.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's one we've been doing a lot of thinking about. And
so what you told me, sorry to cut you off, but your South Island Regional Advertising Manager rang me and he said, we don't have the technology and the money to invest in the technology. As an analyst programmer, with a global reach myself, dealing and hosting companies and websites and software development, to tell me you don't have the money is ridiculous, because I could find you a legion of free open source developers who actually agree with everything you guys are saying about good journalism, Mr. Radio New Zealand, and yet you still won't talk to us.
Yeah, it's a great point, and micropayments are really interesting. I wonder if, Mark, you want to talk briefly about Press Patron and how that's going for you, because it's a model that we've looked at. It's not right for us at the moment, but Mark's doing some great experimentation with micropayments.
Yeah, there's another startup. It was a guy in Wellington who came out of Victoria University, and he got the idea that he had to make it very easy for people to pay. Much to your point, and it's called Press Patron, and we're one of the first to adopt it. I'm happy to share this with you. When we did our own business plan, I thought that we would get zero in terms of people giving us money to support quality journalism. I wanted to put zero in our business plan. My business partner, Tim Murphy, who's former editor of the Herald, he took me into putting $5,000 in there in our business plan. And I thought he was dreaming. Well, after 6 months, we're running at about 60,000 that people are contributing to us on an annual basis. All you have to do is click the Press Patron button. It's very easy. You can drop out of it any time. You can. $5 per month is the most popular choice. So that's one flat white per month, you know, it's been very good. So I think, you know, people are starting to think that they have to pay and are prepared to pay.
But I'm questioning as an advertiser. You're talking about as subscribers.
Right.
What about on the advertiser side?
Okay, that's a different question.
Oh, we've got plenty of ways to pay for that.
But
Perhaps
yet
before
on
we
the
come to
digital
some-
side, you don't.
Sorry, Sue, before we come to some more questions, I mean, I think if we're talking about revenue, it's worth talking about the policy announcement this week in terms of, you know, 38 million from Labour should they get in for Radio New Zealand. And clearly a signal there about the value of public service nature of journalism. Can you speak to me?
Won't say anything directly about the policy, although I think it's good that there's becoming a little bit of a richer debate off the back of that. Not that there's been a hell of a lot, it's not a key issue, but it was interesting that our political party has made public broadcasting and the media problems we've talked about important, and that's quite a bit of money for an organisation like RNZ, and I think the policy would mean we'd only get a proportion of that, but probably the largest proportion initially, subject to what happens in the election, obviously. So, but look, I think it's good that there's some recognition that this is an issue that we should be thinking about. The Greens have a decent policy, as do New Zealand First. So it's starting to happen, I think. And at some point, I think there will need to be more investment into the sector.
Can I ask Joanna your thoughts on that? Because it's very directed at public broadcasters, but your print newspapers, commercial newsrooms have done a lot of the heavy lifting in journalism for years.
Yeah,
So
that's lovely of you to acknowledge that, because it is expensive to continue to fund journalists right across this island and beyond. I would like to see that there was a heavily contestable element to that fund if that were to eventuate. I think it would be useful for that broader conversation to ensure that there was a contestability. But like many New Zealanders, I also think the value of Radio New Zealand is absolutely unsurpassed. It's a wonderful organisation that deserves proper investment.
Mark, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think Paul's done a very good job in getting 38 million out of the Labour Party. Look, I think the elephant in the room, though, is TVNZ. Because why would you, with all due respect to Paul, and I will talk about, I think, some of the reasons why he has got that money. But when you've got the infrastructure sitting there of a very big, large television network, why would a political party that is owned by the state, why would a political party say, hey, we want Radio New Zealand to develop as a TV network? I think I know some of the reasons, and part of it is trust. I think the Labour Party trusts the management of Radio New Zealand to get on with it and do a good job. They do not trust TVNZ. But the loser in that, to some extent, is the taxpayer, because you could spend less money and get a good result by giving TVNZ, particularly say TV1, a charter and tell them to get on with it. Now, Labour doesn't want to do that. Claire Curran said to me, we just can't handle TVNZ management. They'll frustrate us. They'll create delays, they'll fight us. It's better to give the money to Radio New Zealand, they'll get on, they'll do it, and do a quality job. So I think it's about a trust issue, really. TVNZ has destroyed its trust, certainly on that side of the political spectrum.
The Clark government did try that, didn't they? And it
Yes,
didn't work.
didn't work. They got done over by TVNZ management. Then it poses the question, though, why keep TVNZ in state ownership? It's clearly never going to play a role in public broadcasting. All the parties basically say that. And shortly, TVNZ is going to ask for a handout from the taxpayer. Its profits, and it's not just TVNZ, Tara and I were talking about this today. TV3 is unprofitable. It's losing millions of dollars every year. Prime is unprofitable. It's losing millions of dollars every year. Shortly, TVNZ could be unprofitable. For them to keep going, they'll have to ask the government. They'll have to ask its shareholder. So, then we have the Labour Party putting a large amount of money into Radio New Zealand to create a TV station. I just don't know that this is the best thing for the overall television industry in this country. Somebody else is going to go to the wall on that. But I do think that Radio New Zealand has got a deserved reputation for trust and reliability, and comes back to quality journalism. And the political parties do not think TVNZ is involved in quality journalism.
You've mentioned trust, and perhaps before we move to some questions from the audience, I'm interested to get your response to that tension between we serve up investigative journalism, quality journalism, the steel mesh story, the coverage of mental health issues here in Christchurch, all the waterways, Todd Barclay's scoop for Newsroom, and yet on the other hand we watch audience figures around trust in the news media falling through the floor. How do you reconcile the deep distrust that we're held in by communities and the work that we do that serves communities?
It's a wider malaise around trust in public institutions. It's been the fabric that's a support of that has been eroding for a long time, and levels of trust in all sorts of authority organisations or establishment organisations has come under some pressure, so that's part of it. I also think by its very definition, the media are a bunch of buggers. I mean, it's, we do cause mischief, professional mischief, it's what we do. Mostly it's justified, it's not always justified. And I think the public have got perhaps tired of some of the endless self-spruiking that goes on, and the kind of inflating of a news story to make it bigger than Ben Hur when it's not. So I think there's a price that's being paid around sensationalism. And I think the other part of it is, as an industry, we were really powerful. We had these wonderful rivers of gold and very strong business models, whether you're in television or publishing, like I used to work. And you really were just stronger than everyone else in terms of the ability to set the direction and carve out the journalism that you wanted to do, which was really strong, because good journalism has to stand up to authority, it has to be beyond influence. But the flip side of that was an arrogance and a smugness, particularly around when you make mistakes, just confessing that you've made a mistake, being transparent about it and putting it right. You have to drag an editor to that, often with cart horses. So I think an element of this future that we're going to have to build together will be editors and journalists and organisations like RNZ being more transparent, being more open, and actually more responsive when they make mistakes and aware of their impact on people when they've got it wrong. So I'm hopeful that will become a stronger flavour. I think it's going to have to be, or else we're going to be in a lot of trouble.
Do you agree, Joanna?
Yeah, I think the other factor is, other observation I'll make is that journalists have always been, we've struggled with the trust issue. I remember when I graduated, which was the same year that Princess Diana died in the Paris tunnel, and there was a lot of hand-wringing around that time around the impact of the paparazzi and the view of the paparazzi on mainstream journalism. And there was a great deal of discussion at that time how journalists were no longer trusted. So I think there's always been that narrative as an undercurrent. But what I see is that actually we are trusted by New Zealanders because all of us have organisations that all of you turn to for information. And that's a great privilege for us as editors to be the holders of that information. But I also think we have to be very careful not to be too snobby about some of the things that New Zealanders do love. And we've all had a little bit of a giggle over The Bachelor tonight, but we know that New Zealanders actually really like that form of entertainment, and I don't think any of us should sneer at that. We should make sure that popular culture is part of the mix. We need to understand that. We need to understand how the people in the shopping malls are thinking. And none of us should take that for granted and think that we're above that type of thinking.
But the thing is, I think that's what happened to journalism is the Americans came in, they started telling all the journalists, make the stories about you. And it was, especially at TVNZ anyway, they had to put themselves into the story and they kind of forgot to tell the story. I don't know, it seemed to be getting more popular,
So the commentators become the story?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very irritating. Extremely.
And do you see that more in broadcast journalism or is it an observation across the
I
board?
think it's sneaking into newspapers. Yeah. I mean, I don't want to be negative about your newspaper, but lately, hopefully it's only the elections. But having opinion pieces on the front page is very annoying, but hopefully it's just for the elections.
Yeah, it's certainly not a device we used often, but it can be used to great effect on occasion.
Yeah.
I think there's another problem too, though, that we face, and that's the huge increase in spin and spin doctors. And as soon as, and it happened to me in the last few days on the Chinese spy story, as soon as you do a story, you're accused of, oh, that's a smear tactic. That's fake news. It's the person that is being exposed immediately attacks back with a spin machine that says, oh, the media's making all this up, all this. And of course, again on the spy story, the immediate thing was, oh, it's defamatory, we're going to sue. They will never sue. Most people, most of these outfits never ever sue. But it's this attack, it's this constant attack on you for doing your job and giving the public information. The bad guys attack back, and it does have some impact on your reputation and the way people view the media.
Perhaps it's a good opportunity to invite questions. I mean, if we're talking about your view of the media. Yep, down back.
A question and a comment. My question is if the corporations are the ones who are sucking the money out of New Zealand's economy so that you cannot run your businesses because it's an unlevel playing field, they don't pay any tax, you do pay tax, then why don't you write about that every day? Make people really aware of what is going on, because corporations, not only in your area, but in every field, are sucking New Zealand dry, and it needs to be exposed. So that was my question, and I can't remember my comment. I'll have to come back to it. But if you wouldn't mind answering that question.
Who would like to take that?
I'm happy to. Look, we do write about these issues, but we also have to make sure we're not too self-indulgent and too navel-gazing, because we know that you want to read about other things too, and we make a commitment to covering a wide range of issues. But one aspect we haven't touched on is regulation, and one of the real challenges we have when we come up against Google and Facebook is simply the scale at which they operate, which is a global scale. And as you're aware, Fairfax Media and NZME attempted to merge recently and were pushed back by the Commerce Commission, and that's due to be reviewed by the High Court. And the thinking behind that was that the organisations wanted to achieve a scale that would enable them to compete with Google and Facebook, who are our primary commercial competitors. So we've got some real challenge around our regulators understanding the environment within which commercial media works, and I think that's something that our regulators will come to terms with in time, once we see a real erosion of our business.
Can I invite another question? Sir?
Joanna,
if you take that to its logical conclusion, though, you end up with one media organisation in the country, because that's the only scale you'll get to compete with the global scale.
Yeah, I don't accept that. We've got 3 represented right here today in this room. We've got a great many more, and the barriers to entry are a lot lower than before. So any one of you could set up an environment with which to publish content, and that's where you get that real diversity of voice. But you're absolutely right, that is something that New Zealanders are worried about, and the Commerce Commission, that was their part of their primary decision for declining the merger.
Can I see a hand over here? Yes.
But how do you counter natural biases that can occur in journalism?
Sorry, how can you counter biases in journalism?
Yeah.
By having a diversified media, and I think that's one of the issues. If you rationalise the industry, then you reduce the number of voices. We all know everybody has inherent bias, but you get round it by having a wide and varied media, and with plenty of media organisations. Yeah.
One other way to achieve it is to make sure you have a range of institutions. I mean, it can't just be a whole lot of bunch of freelancers making content and sort of putting it onto the online. So having a range of good institutions that hire trained staff, that train their staff, have good editing and work to a code of ethics, and who are receptive to feedback from the audience and listen to it when the audience complains.
Do staff feel that they fairly represent all sectors of New Zealand?
Oh, look, we would love to have greater diversity. One of the real challenges we have as an industry is attracting real diversity through our journalism schools and into the industry. We are working hard and doing a lot of thinking around that, but I really struggle to attract Māori journalists for whatever reason they're coming into the industry, and that really challenges and upsets me. I'd like to do a lot more in that space.
Sorry, maybe that's where your hand up.
My question is about comments, because I sometimes wonder whether there are independent journalists with several different personas going in and commenting on articles as complete arseholes. And I just wonder whether it is helpful to society and democracy to have people able to comment on articles anonymously with pseudonyms and what have you. Should we not be making people sort of log in via RealMe and actually front up to the nasty little things they say?
We turned them off, and because we tried to do it and we didn't think it was providing much in terms of reliable content. But I think I read a lot of the stuff, comments, and I find them useful, but I take them with a pinch of salt. But often they do add to the story. Sorry?
They're useful, but they're horrific.
Some of them are horrific. They are moderated, aren't they, Joanna?
Yeah. We've done a big piece of work recently called Civil Society, where we deliberately aimed to clean up our community and make sure that there was a much higher quality of discussion within our community. But I also greatly respect freedom of expression, transparency, and the ability for people to have constructive conversations. And I read a really interesting piece in The Guardian recently about this, where accessibility organisation was making the case for anonymous comments because it allowed people to articulate a view that they may not otherwise feel safe sharing if they needed to put their name to it. So they gave the example of somebody who had been abused and another person who was talking quite candidly about coming out to their family, and they wouldn't have been able to do that, they felt, if they put their name to it. But I do accept that anonymous commenting can create some difficulties because you don't know who it is. But we do know who they are, so they have to register, and we do know their identity, and we're able to moderate that.
I would just say that that in the paper press, people who have any risk in terms of submitting an article or an opinion would always be able to do that in confidence to the editor and still have the opinion expressed. In other words, if you could have a mechanism for people to be able to comment anonymously if it was appropriate.
I think the awful thing about these comments is it shows the very low standard of education in this country.
People cannot use apostrophes these days.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, Radio New Zealand. Are Radio New Zealand employees allowed to belong to New Zealand First under their own name?
I'm just trying to remember our policy. It depends which part of the organisation you're in.
All right.
We can't rule out the ability of people to be members of a political party because it's a basic human right.
Right.
But we have very careful rules around managing conflict. And if you were a working journalist, you wouldn't be able to do it. But we have lots of different staff who are in technical areas who have the same right as anyone else.
No, I was just listening to the interview this morning with Winston Peters, so it's fine, but it doesn't really belong to New Zealand.
I can guarantee it was one of the more extraordinary interviews I've had for a while.
started singing.
I'm just interested, I have my own opinions. But how challenging is it for you guys to, one, attract high quality journalists, people who are passionate about their profession, and then actually keep them and their skills? I'm just wondering if someone would like to make a comment.
We do a pretty good job of hiring the people that we want, but we don't retain some of them as long as we'd like. But that's because, again, another paradox. At a time when the industry's in a bit of trouble, there's a talent war going on for good journalists, and there are lots of opportunities for top draw journalists. Our turnover is about 10% a year, which is relatively low. But even in the last couple of weeks, we've lost staff that I would love to have kept. But we've hired probably more who we're glad to have, and it's not bad for people to go and work for other organisations and then come back. But it's getting harder, I reckon.
Oh, well, I think they're all turning up at our door. No, to be honest, I think, and we're talking to Tara's students today, that journalism isn't a job. It's a vocation, it's a lifestyle. You don't do it for the money. Well, you want to earn a reasonable living, sure. But it's driven by a lot of other things, and it's a tough job. The thing that I fear most about it is that the economic model, it's not so much the salary levels, it's the workload expected of journalists now. If you work in all our organisations are multimedia, all of them now. Radio New Zealand reporters will be expected to do video, online, radio stories, morning report, etc. Staff reporters are the same. And the workloads are really, really heavy. And that's one of the things where some of the reporters that are coming to talk to us say they just want to escape this nightmare of this journalism, as it's called, of turning over all this product and not being able to do it to a level that gives you really good job satisfaction. So that's a real problem for journalists in this country.
Last question.
Oh, sorry, this might not be good enough for the last question. I was going to say that, do you think journalists would be happier if they could have copy editors back? And the second part of that question is, would you consider asking to see if we could crowdfund copy editors? Because I think that you might find there's quite a large appetite for us to help you have them.
Do you mean sub-editors?
Yes, I suppose I do mean sub-editors. You've got to forgive me because I'm not in the world of journalism, but I'm talking about the people that fix the spelling mistakes and
get all the subs in the room, I see.
You raised an interesting point though, because we were talking here about collaboration between newsrooms, but where do we sit in terms of developing collaboration with our communities in terms of citizen, pro-am journalism? Is it something any of you are, well, you've got the new Voxpot.
Yeah. We're certainly really interested in engaging with our community and stimulating discussion and being able to create content that's relevant. The idea of crowdsourcing some copy editing, it could work, but it wouldn't just be anyone, and you'd have to, it would be worth giving it a try.
We're all sitting down the back.
Yeah. I have to say we've kept sub-editors, but we're fortunate. We're protected from the extreme commercial pressures that have led to those changes in other organisations. But I think good journalism, you asked good journalism is always well edited. There's no doubt about that.
Sorry, can I ask a question about you're talking about Radio New Zealand and sub-editor? I'm not sure what they do with some of these soundbites, because I listened to an interview on Radio New Zealand, and then I get a soundbite, and it talks about the interview, and it says so-and-so said this, and my impression is that's not what they actually said. They actually
Yeah.
said something more than that.
Oh, it's been edited?
Chopped.
Yeah, and out
Yeah.
of context.
Out
Yeah,
of context.
yeah,
yes.
yeah. No, well, look, we try to edit judiciously to convey the nub of a story really, really clearly, but there will be occasions when some of the colours missed. But we do quite long items as well. So mostly, I mean, some of our interviews are 50 minutes if you can get it out in that time. But no, so probably in news coverage there is strong editing that goes on.
That's on them.
Yeah, we do try to make sure we keep the balance in the context.
Last question down the back, please.
Just remembered my comment. TVNZ, I'm interested in the fact that they might be in trouble and would love you to write about it and investigate it and make it very, very clear that I would be really peeved off if we bailed them out. Because I think if that's the way they're going, then their equipment and everything should just be sold off and someone else can take it on and they can cover a TV station.
I might speak on defence of TVNZ, just to be a bit provocative. It's a wonderful brand and people still trust it. Enormous audience engagement, I think a couple of million people a week. And they still do some really good work. Their problem, I think, is that they are a commercial network that is publicly owned with absolutely no obligations around public service. And that worked as long as the advertising market supported that model. And the problem they've got is that that's changing. And I think, Mark, you're quite right to ask the question of whether they can adapt, because they've got some real challenges. But the value, and I think this is the point you were making, the value of the TVNZ brand is still enormous. So, yeah.
Thank you all so much for your questions. I'm just going to ask our panellists if they've got any last comments to wrap up. Mark, perhaps you'd like to.
Well, I just suppose I would go back to saying that we do have a problem. There is a problem, and something needs to be done about the Facebook Google situation. I don't know what can, but if people in this room, I guess, need to say to the politicians, you've got to make this some sort of priority, or you won't be getting that newspaper through your letterbox. You won't be turning on the television and seeing 6 o'clock bulletin. Yeah, that would be my plea to you all.
I would just like to thank you all. You're all here because you believe in journalism, presumably, and your support is absolutely essential to allowing us to continue, whether it's your support as an audience or actually paying for one of our products. You get what you pay for, and in order to support journalism in many of our communities, we require the support from those communities, either as advertisers or subscribers. So please do keep continuing to support us. And the other thing I would say as an outgoing editor is that journalism is an absolute privilege. It's something we do because we love serving our communities. So do trust us, do trust our people. We do it because we love it and we love New Zealand. Thank you.
And just one comment I'd make is that we've been sold a pup in some ways. There is a kind of assumption that people aren't interested in intelligent coverage, they're not interested in long-form, challenging news and current affairs. It's somehow The Bachelor is enough for us. And that's actually wrong. I just want to give an example. We had a function in Wellington at Te Papa on Friday night for a series we did called The Night Floor, where we did these extended interviews with all of the surviving Prime Ministers, apart from John Key, who we want to give a bit of time for him to be decontaminated before we talk. And we booked a big venue, and we had to just turn away scores of people, probably hundreds of people, and there wasn't even a chair for the chair of, there wasn't even a spot at the front for the chair of Radio New Zealand. We had 4 of the Prime Ministers there. The room was packed and with a lot of young people. And that series, which is really quite challenging, I don't know whether anyone has heard that or watched it. It's now a book. People loved it. It's been the most successful piece of journalism we've done this year. It's going to be on TV3 as a TV show after the election. But the point I'm making is our policymakers and our politicians think we prefer stupid things. They think we're not educated as a people. we're not, and we've just kind of got to push back and show that we've got an appetite for challenging content. And thanks for coming tonight, because I think it does underline that point.
Thank you so much.